my offices were so cold that I couldn't concentrate, and my staff was typing with gloves on. I pleaded with Jimmy to set the thermostats at 68, but it didn't do any good. Dude, how's Helena doing? I mean, so you guys are inducing Saturday?
Yeah. So we are almost at 41 weeks, which, if you don't know, when you're pregnant, you demarcate things in units of weeks, not months.
Okay.
And 40 is the target.
Right.
But yeah, if you get to 42, I guess the risk of unpleasant things starts going up pretty quick, so they induce.
Yeah.
It's like the term is, it's a vaginal wafer. Just think about that for a sec. Yeah.
Whoa. So it's not a pill or something.
It's like a tampon with a certain chemical on it. So you just like keep that bad boy in there till
the show hits the road.
Yeah, exactly. Looking forward to it, man. Gonna be a dad by next week, which is crazy.
Yeah, that's fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Speaking of ourselves, though, we received some feedback to actually say who we are at the beginning of episodes. So we should probably start giving our names.
Because we just got into this habit of like talking to each other, and we completely forgot that like you're supposed to do this like nice like intro like John McWhorter and Glenn Laurie do. But
I'm Ben. I was born at 340 parts per million.
I love that.
Actually, I have no idea. Yeah, I'm out of Stanford at the moment.
I'm Vaden. I am out of University of British Columbia. We've been doing this little podcast for 33 episodes now, 34 episodes,
and all that time we've never had to do like a housekeeping. But I think episode 30, whatever this is going to be, 34 or something. This is it. We have to do a housekeeping. And hopefully we never have to do a housekeeping for another 34 episodes. Okay, yeah. So we got a couple things. Yeah, the first thing was that do intros. So we got that covered. Yeah, one thing is that we've got, I think you mentioned it in a episode with Chris, but we've got like a little Discord for the community that has grown up around the podcast. And we kept it pretty quiet for a while. Because we didn't want it to, we wanted to...
Filled with creeps and weirdos?
Yeah, I was trying to phrase that. Yeah, thank you for doing it for me. I mean, some creeps and weirdos.
Yeah,
we just wanted to control the percentage. But I think we might start opening up a bit. So I don't think we're going to post the link publicly, but you can either email us or Twitter or something. Then we can send you the link. So if you're interested in that, it's a great group of people, wide variety of interests. We don't just talk about heady philosophy and stuff. There's like lots of arguments happening about all sorts of topics under the sun. And honestly, it's a great thing to have open throughout my workday because there's constantly interesting stuff to distract me from other work I should be doing. But there's a lot, I learn lots of stuff and I have my mind changed pretty often and get in a non-trivial amount of debates, which is always a good time. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, just give us a shout. Speaking of email, we should just say for those of you who don't read the descriptions, our email is incrementspodcast@gmail.com. And we've gotten some super nice emails there, some nice feedback, and we always respond.
Yeah.
If you feel like yelling at us, we will certainly respond. That also brings us to our Twitter accounts, our social media. So we got a bit of a late start on social media, but now we're there, baby.
Yeah.
So we have a Twitter account, Increments Pod, right? What the hell's our handle?
At Increments Pod.
At Increments Pod.
Yeah, I think we have all of 23 followers, excluding family and ourselves. We're maybe down to 16. But come join, come hang out.
And we're also on YouTube now. So I don't know what to make of that, but we're there. So we're doing our thing. We're doing our service. We're buying into the attention economy, baby. We want your attention and we want it now.
Yeah. We've never said to review the podcast and leave positive reviews and stuff, because whenever I hear that, I never do it. So I'm just assuming other people aren't going to do it either. But, if you want to leave nice comments and places, it would be great. Getting the name out there, proselytizing the good word of K-pop.
Yeah, we don't ask for much. If you could just rate us, borrow your dad's phone, use him to rate us, borrow your siblings' phones, use them to rate us. That's all we need, really. A couple blood oaths, maybe name your firstborn child, increments.
Just very minimal.
Much.
Yeah, we're not that needy. Yeah. Cool. No,
apparently it actually does help. So that actually would be appreciated. Yeah.
And then we got a lot of criticism and stuff from the previous episode that I think we're going to go into.
There was some positive stuff. There was some negative stuff. There was some talk of us getting our heads out of our ass with respect to certain things. So
yeah. I'd say most of the feedback that I got was super positive. There was definitely some people saying, I think one phrase was we're like closeted right wingers, which I just thought was hilarious. Yeah, so most of the feedback was good. Definitely had some interesting criticism, which we will get into in the main segment. And I'm going to grab another beer and let's get into it. But I know that you've been going down this big rabbit hole about the degrowth movement.
Dude, I'm getting obsessed. It's bad.
So, like, can you tell me about this? And then we'll maybe just pepper in the various criticisms that we've gotten throughout this conversation. But
if we miss one of your criticisms, we'll get to it someday.
Yeah.
Send us an email.
Yeah.
So the degrowth movement, it as far as I can tell, started like early 2000s, originated in France, like basically just anti-consumerism, right? Anti-capitalism, anti-consumerism, thinking that this train we're on of like continual economic progress and marching forward is just unsustainable.
Yeah.
And these are the, typical talking points. Like, we're on this finite planet, we have finite resources, and we're extracting these at some faster and faster rate every year. How could we possibly go on in this way, right? This has got to come to an end. We've got to start to live in equilibrium with the planet at some point. So this involves various things depending on who you're talking to, but probably like population reduction and living closer with nature, and like less consumerism, right? We don't need as much stuff. We should start reusing all our clothes and all of this stuff. But then it really seems to split, because with these sort of movements, there's sort of this utopian ideological component where everyone sort of envisions themselves living on like tomato farms and holding hands with their neighbors, right? But no one specifically knows what this will entail. Maybe Jason Hickel, who is, I think, an anthropologist. I might be getting that wrong, but he wrote a book in 2020 called Less is More, More is Less, Less is More, something like that, sort of arguing for degrowth as an economic solution. If the movement has a sort of figurehead, he might be the one to turn to. But in general, when you start perusing this online, you realize everyone has like very different ideas about like what this would entail. But generally, it's cutting back, right? It's a criticism of capitalism and consumerism and our current ways of energy use, right? And it says like, we have to stop this. We have to live more in harmony with nature, stop abusing the planet, quote unquote, and reducing our impact in every way. That's the general premise.
There seems to be an interesting asymmetry, because when I hear about economic development, it sounds so vague and abstract. And what comes into my mind is things like tuxedo wearing lawyers and bankers making a lot of money on the stock market. And then when I think about like Bangladesh, I think about poor indigent farmers just trying to scrape by. And then I can imagine the degrowth movement kind of capitalizes on this. And it's like, look at what economic growth is. It's about capitalism and greed. And and I know this isn't the case, but can you explain to both me and then obviously the listeners as well, like what people mean when they talk about economic growth and why it isn't this greedy capitalist Mr. Pennypacker stuffing his pockets with dollar bills, and it actually is affecting the poor farmer, and because I think that goes a long way to explaining the appeal of the degrowth movement.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things there. One is, what is economic growth? What is growth? And one is like how we measure it. So
nice.
Like growth is production, basically. So we have needs, we have wants, we have desires, and via typically like positive sum trades between people, I pay you for a service, you pay me for a service, we can start to meet those needs. And by positive sum, I just mean an interaction is positive for both of us. So we can trade things between us, and because you're a better artist than I am a chef or something, I can pay you to make art, and that benefits me. And then you abstract this to the economy as a whole, and basically it's functioning correctly, like a bunch of positive sum interactions. And as evidence to see that it's positive sum, you could just look around you, right? So like, we started with nothing, and all this stuff came from somewhere, and it came from trade and interactions between people and agreements between people to like have some people produce some things, you pay them something for it, and together we're sort of meeting needs.
Well, and every time you, the listener, goes and buys a cup of coffee, you are engaging in what you just described, because to buy a cup of coffee is to go to a store and say to the person on the other side, I value your heated brown liquid more than I value my $2. And the person on the other side says, I value your $2 more than my heated brown liquid. And we exchange. and both of us are happier for it. And I think it's also called the Ricardo principle, where like you have that famous example from David Ricardo, the economist, who talks about how the reason it's positive sum is because we're saving time, where if it takes me 10 hours to make an arrow and it takes me 1 hour to make a club, and it takes you 10 hours to make a club and 1 hour to make an arrow, then it makes a lot of sense for me to make the thing which I'm more efficient at and you to make the thing that you're more efficient at, and then trade, rather than us both make our own and cost 11 hours. We can get the same amount of stuff for 2 hours. And this process is infinitely scalable too, right? It's not that at some point it will stop being valuable. It's that if we generalize this, we are all trading everything with everyone, and we start getting an economy, and we start getting a market. And to talk about economic development is to talk about trying to include as many people within this process as we can.
And so this is not to say that economic growth can't lead to inequality. It certainly can, and almost as a necessity, it will. Not everyone will be completely equal via these trading mechanisms, but everyone should end up better than they were at the beginning. And also, this is not to say that you can't disrupt this process in various ways. So, like you can have extractive economies. You can have this at the level of countries, at the level of companies, at the level of people, right? Where you're like forcing people to make things inequitably and things like this, right? So the process can go wrong, but it's the best process. This sort of like trading mechanism is the best process we know of to date to just like increase everyone's well-being. So that's sort of just like when we say growth, we mean this like global process of markets and trade that everyone is sort of involved in. And just to your point about like the businessmen in Bangladesh, the reality is like trading between richer and poorer countries, and incorporating poorer countries into the markets of richer countries, which includes both just like trading with them at a country level, like imports and exports, but also involves like immigration and just like linking the economies of countries is the best mechanism we know of to lift developing countries out of poverty. So like this trading mechanism and incorporating countries in the global market is basically the best way we know of to like actually get countries to be like sustainable on their own. And so then there's the question of like, how do we measure this? Typically it's like gross domestic product, right? GDP, and which is just a measure of like how much actual material production is happening in an economy. And people will argue that this measure is imperfect, which is very true, but it's a pretty good measure of growth and just like this process in general. And also GDP happens to just correlate very, very strongly with other things we care about. So this is a point like someone like Pinker will make repeatedly, right? Is like, even just leaving aside the specifics of what GDP is, if you just look at GDP in countries, as GDP goes up, we see like more equality, things like women's participation in the workforce. We see more leisure time. We see more material benefits. So people just like housing, shelter, food, housing and shelter, as if those are different things. So yeah, housing, food, security of various things, typically more peaceful countries, right? So it's just like an increase in GDP just increases that. It's a good correlate to a lot of other things we care about. And bringing us back to growth, like what I find so interesting is like the utopian element of the community, right? And like this fucking annoying bait and switch they do where they'll like try and sate your appetite for this like wholesome community living. Everyone's living in harmony and peace. Don't think too hard about it. It all makes sense. Trust me, and just go along with it. And while ignoring like the actual implications of their view. So there's an article in The Conversation about degrowth and like how it would look as a lifestyle. Here is what they say. So here's some quotes. In a degrowth society, we would aspire to localize our economies as far and as appropriately as possible. This would assist with reducing carbon-intensive global trade while also building resilience in the face of an uncertain and turbulent future. We would tend to reduce our working hours in the formal economy in exchange for more home production and leisure. We would have less income, but more freedom. Thus, in our simplicity, we would be rich. Wherever possible, we would grow our own organic food, water our gardens with water tanks, and turn our neighborhoods into edible landscapes as the Cubans have done in Havana.
Oh my god. Yeah.
um, and so what I find, I mean, what I find so annoying about this is that it's like so dishonest, right? Like it's, if you're going to advocate like shrinking the economy, don't try and pretend like, okay, if you're just like convinced climate change is an existential risk and the only way you can combat it is to shrink the economy, then say that, but then be upfront about what that would entail, right? That's gonna be shit, right? That's gonna be much less leisure time, much less freedom, especially economic freedom.
Yeah.
It's gonna be like a subsistence society. Like growing our own food is so, it's so unmanageable at a large scale for like 10 billion people to be growing their own food. It's like, it's just unthinkable. And then we're not going to have any sort of separation of duties or economies of scale. So we're, then like, where are the doctors? Like who's performing surgeries? There's no specialization. Like how are we combating global pandemics? Like there's just, and then you think of like people just growing their own local organic food. That's great. And then you think about winter in Canada. What are they going to be doing during winter? Who's going to be developing like the food storage technology, right? And so what it drives me fucking nuts is this like very like flowery verbiage they use to sell the idea, and it's so patently dishonest. And so one article I found that was criticizing degrowth a bit, I just had to read this because I fucking thought it was hilarious. Like this is what I want out of like a real degrowther. And he was saying it would be nice to hear it straight for once. Global warming is real, it's here, and it's mind-bogglingly dangerous. Averting catastrophe will thus require places like the United States and Canada to make drastic cutbacks, bringing their consumption more closely in line with the planetary average. Such cuts can be made more or less fairly, and the richest really ought to pay the most, but the crucial thing is that they are made. That will be hard. Not only will our standards of living almost certainly drop, but it's likely that the very quality of our society, equality, safety, and trust, will decline too. That's not something to be giddy about, but it's still a price that those of us living in affluent countries should be prepared to pay. Because however difficult it is to slow down, flooding Bangladesh cannot be an option. So at least if you're convinced that this is like an absolute existential threat and we have to like contract the economy, then at least be honest about the actual consequences there, which is why I appreciated that last article.
Dude, it reminds me of the from each according to their ability to each according to their needs.
Totally.
It's like, it sounds nice when written in an essay, but when you are running the factory, that's not very helpful,
Yeah.
And similarly with a lot of this flowery verbiage, it's like, it's not meant to be practical or actionable. It's meant to elicit a particular feeling. And that feeling is human beings, but in particular us in the West, are bad and we're hurting other people and we need to pay for it. In the climate episode, we talked a little bit about like the religious impulse. And I think that it always kind of funnels back to that, because it's very much this concept of like original sin. This concept that the Catholics had exploited all those many centuries ago. But I am guilty by virtue of my birth and heritage. And I was born into a pleasant life, and I should feel guilty and ashamed of it. And the only way I can repent and repay is by sacrificing something. And that impulse, I think many people feel without having language to express it. And then when they read paragraphs like this, it lands with them. It's like, yes, I have had a good life and I do need to repay. And maybe we should degrowth it, but it doesn't actually mean anything. It's not concrete. It's not specific. It doesn't translate into any actual tangible action. It's a feeling state that appeals to certain people.
And I mean, this is all just also putting aside the fact that like this does nothing for developing countries. As we chatted about earlier, trade and immigration and things is a huge boon to developing countries. And if anything, we want much, much more of it, right? We want more open borders. We want less trade restrictions. And to reduce the developed economies from a positive sum situation where we're trading and mutually to mutual benefit, and reducing that to like some zero sum or negative sum competition, this would just be horrendous for the planet at large.
Well, it strikes me as like this idea of mutual benefit is also
anathema,
alien for most people, because it's like, if I'm benefiting, I must be taking something from other people. It's this idea of, this is a Marxian idea of like extracting value, extracting wealth from other people. So rather than thinking of trade with Bangladesh as being mutually beneficial, it is seen as exploitative and extractative. I don't know if that's a word, but it's, if we are benefiting, we must be extracting. That's the only way that we could, because there's a finite amount of value, rather than recognizing it's just the same as the club and the arrow. It's a specialization and an exchange. And when you have this exchange, both parties benefit in a scalable, infinite way. But I think it's very counterintuitive, because I think there's like so in machine learning, we talk about like the no free lunch theorem. But I think there's like just a deep seated, there's got to be no free lunch in every aspect of our lives that most people feel, which is like, if I'm benefiting, you must be losing. But occasionally we can have these positive feedback loops where both parties engage in something that benefits both of them, and value is created ex nihilo. It's created from scratch, from nothing. And now we have value. And like, of course it has to be like this, because where did all of this amazing stuff come from? Like it's, of course it's ex nihilo, but because it's hard to see that, I think people default to the easier position, which is it must be exploitative, it must be extracting, it must be oppressive. And that, I think, is why a lot of these utterly vacuous paragraphs, I think, resonate with people. And
if the listener is still skeptical, there's, two recent natural experiments here, which I think are useful to consider. One was just the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of the importing of developed countries stopped, right? So the economy did shrink for a while there, because we were all nothing much was happening in the economies. And so this had a doubly negative impact on developing countries, because for one, they were also getting hit with the pandemic, right? So they had local, people couldn't go to work and stuff. So, but also they ceased the relations with developed countries. And so they retracted even more and are having a much harder time coming out of it than developed countries are. And somewhat related, because developed countries are now coming out, and countries at large are slowly emerging from the pandemic, energy use has spiked, but production of energy is slightly farther behind. So there's this big right now, what's called an energy crunch, where just demand is much higher than supply for energy right now. And developing countries are really getting fucked right now. So there's protests in the streets in Brazil, right? Because people are having to choose between food and energy and what they need to pay for and stuff. And so this is just a taste of what would be to come if we were to just drastically cut back on energy or growing economies and things like this. So if you're inclined towards humanitarianism, you should not want to retract our economies. It would be very bad for a lot of people.
This kind of leads to another criticism that we got, which is that our previous episode was far too human-centric. We didn't talk about... so a friend of mine coined an excellent phrase, which was we didn't talk about the hysteria of the precious. And what she means by this is that a tree falls in the forest and there goes the death of a spider, and we lose a species, and the environment is just filled with all these precious aspects that we have to preserve, we have to keep, we have to save them. And so I think a lot of listeners, upon hearing our previous conversation, may have been thinking these guys, they don't care about the environment at all. They just care about human beings.
Yeah, so I have two responses, I guess, which are maybe somewhat linked. The first is, if biodiversity and animals are not killing off as many species as possible is your concern, then we should be very concerned about energy dense production, right? So places where energy is produced, there's a lot of energy produced per unit area. And this is not at all the case with renewables, where you have to clear massive amount of forest land and stuff. And had to clear place in the Amazon and Germany, etc., to make way for massive wind farms and massive solar farms and stuff. And so if this is your concern, then, and you're against something like nuclear, I would say that's a bizarre position to take. And so I think my answer is basically that's great if we're going to focus on this stuff. So let's focus on energy dense production. that meets humans' energy needs and also limits the extent of our harm to the environment.
And so I was looking into this a little bit, and so I agree with everything you said, and I also agree with our opponents who care about the environment. Like, of course, I care about the environment. So I don't want us to appear as if we don't like the environment, but things are not nearly as bad as they are painted to be. So this is a quote from Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. He says, "Thanks to habitat protection and targeted conservation efforts, many beloved species have been pulled back from the brink of extinction, including albatrosses, condors, manatees, oxes, pandas, rhinoceroses, Tasmanian devils, and tigers. According to the ecologist Stuart Pym, the overall rate of extinction has been reduced by 75%. So I just wanted to flag that I think that a lot of the facts that people have in their head about humans ruining the environment are just wrong.
Yeah.
Like, they aren't true.
Yeah, nice.
They aren't true because they come from headlines. But headlines, as we talked about earlier, are the least reliable information source. And you have to go out of your way to look for good news. And in doing some research, I found this amazing set of articles. The title is 99 Good News Stories You Probably Didn't Hear About in 2018. And then there's one for 2020, and then there's one for 2019.
Is this Future Crunch?
19. Yes, it is.
So good.
And I just want to read a couple of them because I think that there is this myth out there that the environment is collapsing when that's just factually not true. It's just not true. And so I'm just going to read a couple of these because I think it's very important to disabuse people of this notion that, one, the human beings are ruining the environment, and two, that the things are getting worse because things are getting better and human beings are doing less damage to the environment than we were in the past. So just a couple of headlines. So following China's ban on ivory last year, ivory demand has dropped by almost half, and poaching rates are falling in places like Kenya. The population of wild tigers in Nepal was found to have nearly doubled in the last 9 years, thanks to efforts by conservationists and increased funding for protected areas. Deforestation in Indonesia fell by 60% as a result of a ban on clearing peatlands, new educational campaigns, and better law enforcement. So 99 times 3 is 297. I've read 3 of these, and there's 294 left that you can read. And these are headlines which you don't know about, dear listener, because they don't get circulated as widely. And it's because of this horrible glitch in human psychology that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. And that glitch is we focus on things that are going wrong, because if things are going right, it's not going to kill us. And so our attention is naturally drawn to things that are going wrong. But when people make claims that the environment is being destroyed, I think they're making these claims because they have heard them from other people and they haven't spent time to see if they're true or not. And Pinker's book is filled with them. For example, the amount of oil spills over the last 100 years are decreasing significantly. The amount of clear-cut rainforest is decreasing. Another factoid here. I'm just going to spit out a bunch of these and then people can fact check me. This one comes from Schellenberger. It's not the case that humankind has failed to conserve habitat. By 2019, an area of Earth larger than the whole of Africa was protected, an area that is equivalent to 15% of the Earth's land surface. The number of designated protected areas in the world has grown from 9,000 in 1962 to 100,000 in 2003 to 250,000 in 2020. And this is, again, the number of designated preserved areas in the world. So like last time we talked a bit about this like double distillation process of having journalists pick out the most sensational sentences from the IPCC report, and then you get news articles, and then you pick out the most sensational news articles. And then you just are left with this picture that the world is imploding and human beings are the cause of it. And this just is not true. So even if you disagree with everything we've said about nuclear power, please just look at the data and look for good news because it's everywhere. Just people don't seek it out.
Another nice one I came across recently is that the gross gain in land cover in 2016 was about 2 million square kilometers. So this is forest cover, so canopy cover, right? So we're actually getting better at like protecting our forests as time goes on and as we become more efficient at energy production and using resources, which brings us to the concept of decoupling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Hugely important. Yeah.
So the concept of decoupling is referring to two things. So one is economic growth, and then one is emissions, right? So a claim you'll hear made often is that with economic growth, as we're producing all these things, factories are churning, we're using all this dirty form of energy, and so our carbon emissions are increasing. But what this ignores is that over time, we actually become better and more efficient at using energy. One, we're finding cleaner and more efficient uses of energy. Two, regulations are kicking into place. We'll introduce things like carbon taxes and stuff. And so anyway, so there's this super thorough report by this fella, Zeke something. Anyway, this comes from the Breakthrough Institute, Zeke Housefather.
Can we just pause for a second? That is a badass name, Zeke Housefather.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so nice. He actually liked I tweeted at him today and he liked it. So, I might be too cool for this podcast pretty goddamn soon. But he writes this article about absolute decoupling of economic growth and emissions in 32 countries. And this is taking into account not just territorial emissions, so not just emissions that are within the country, but also consumer emissions, so emissions that are like exported elsewhere. And notes that from the period between 2005 and 2019, 32 countries with over 1 million people, so he restricted the analysis to like big countries, experienced like absolute decoupling. So as their economies were growing, their GDP were growing up, their emissions were decreasing. And so anyway, we'll put that in the show notes. But this is just all to say that we don't have to sacrifice higher quality of life that goes along with economic growth in order to be kinder to the earth. Yeah.
And not only do we not have to sacrifice it, but there's a mechanism called the environmental Kuznets curve. Do you know about this?
I don't know if I do, actually.
Yeah, so this is just the principle that as countries start to develop, they start at first to draw more on the environment to cause more pollution. And the Industrial Revolution and Charles Dickinson times. But then they get to a peak period of development when now they can start concerning themselves with non-essential concerns like the environment. And then they can start using the economic development to start drawing less on the environment. So fossil fuels are a good example. We're moving from wood, bad for the environment. Fossil fuels, not good for the environment. Nuclear power and natural gas, better. Again, not perfect, but better. Mm-hmm. And so it is often summarized as the solution to pollution is economic growth. And if you are in a developing country where all you are thinking about is like where your next meal is going to come from, you're not concerning yourself too much with pollution. But if you're in an affluent country where there is a full-fledged environmentalist movement, like where do environmentalist movements come from? Very affluent countries. Mm-hmm. Then people start to figure out ways to draw less on the environment. So this is important because it pushes back against this idea that it's the economy versus the environment. It's not one versus the other. It's both are important. And in fact, if you care about the environment, as I do, mm-hmm. And as you do, then you should care about the economy as the means by which we improve the environment. It's not a one versus the other thing. And this, something that is so bizarre to me, so interesting, is like we got some flack for what we said in the previous episode, but I'm thinking like, what is the opposite position to our position? So our position is, or at least my position, I don't want to speak for you, is that climate change is real. It's a problem. It's one that we can solve and that we will continue to work at slowly to improve. But people who didn't like what we were saying, like, what is their view? Are they saying that climate change is real and the world's going to end? Are they actually defending the claim that the world's going to end?
I think unless we cut back significantly.
So it's the cutback thing. Yeah, okay, so that's where the degrowth stuff comes in. It's like,
I mean, the argument there would be that it's not happening fast enough, right? So like the world is on target for some sort of warming where, like you said, there's a lot of uncertainty around these estimates, but like the worst case scenarios are that we trigger some sort of runaway feedback loop of to some extent. This is not like this is not in the consensus. If you're going to just appeal to the consensus of the climate experts, like a runaway feedback loop, like something you would see on Venus, is actually not the consensus. But I mean, I think the worry of a lot of the people that are most concerned about this is that we're going to pass some point at which we can't return to sort of a normal life, or like the effects are going to be so bad that millions of us will die and we'll be in some state of anarchy or something, right? Like, yeah.
Because this gets us to another criticism we received, which is that you or I or both said that people have been making claims like this for a long time. And some listeners didn't believe us. So I found some examples. Found some examples. And I like this one from Matt Ridley. And so the context is that in the mid 1970s, it was very fashionable for journalists to talk about global cooling. And then 30 years later, it's global warming. And then after that, it's now climate change.
So on the global cooling point, I have a funny story, which is that in the 70s, in the early 70s, Jimmy Carter was president of the US. And he was influenced by the environmentalist movement of that time, which is very concerned about global cooling and pollution. And he took their concerns to such an extent that he vowed to turn down the thermostat in the White House to I think to He's the low 60s. And there's a quote from his wife, Rosalind Carter. My offices were so cold that I couldn't concentrate, and my staff was typing with gloves on. I pleaded with Jimmy to set the thermostats at 68, but it didn't do any good. And at his first meeting with the National Security Council, Carter announced, "This is the last warm meeting we'll have." And so this is the president of the United States being so terrified by these apocalyptic predictions that he's like hampering the entire productivity of the executive branch of the United States.
Jimmy, no.
No, Jimmy. And so there was a huge movement then of everyone turning down their thermostats, right? And he was like trying to exemplify this attitude. And so, as we talked about last time, it was Nixon that signed that created the EPA. And he was signing it into act. A quote from him is, "The 1970s absolutely must be the time when America pays its debt to the past by reclaiming the purity of its air, its water, and our living environment. It is literally now or never." Right. So this has been happening since at least the 70s.
Okay, so I found this one. This is an article on the Wayback Machine, and it actually was released on my birthday, my literal birthday, June 29th, 1989, which is the day of my birth. Yeah. Wow. So the UN predicts disaster if global warming not checked. A senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures will create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, says Noel Brown, director of the New York office on the UN Environmental Program. This one is from 1982. Mostafa K. Tolba, executive director of the United Nations Environmental Program, told delegates that if nations of the world continue, they would face by the turn of the century an environmental catastrophe which would witness devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. We haven't even talked about Paul Ehrlich. Mr. God. Paul Ehrlich, who describes human beings as a cancer, a tumor that needs to be excised. Or Thomas Malthus, who talked about overpopulation. And so what's the mechanism with all of these crazy predictions? Like, this is the other thing, is it's so easy to understand. It's not complicated. It's very easy. So the mechanism is you take a trend, let's just say population trends, and then you just extrapolate it into the future forever until something terrible happens. So let's say population has doubled over the last 10 years. And so you just assume it's going to keep doubling forever. But this never happens because conditions change and trends stop. So you don't have a trend just continuing until catastrophe. Yeah. What you have is a trend petering out. Things change. It just changes.
Yeah. But importantly, you can't predict what will change, right? Which makes everything very hard. And so I think so there's the mechanism, but there's like the psychological mechanism that leads people to making these predictions. And I think that is just that you can't foresee what technological innovation or what change of behavior will result in the trend changing. And so you can't really help but just say, fires have been increasing in California for the past 10 years. In 20 years, the world is going to be one giant ass forest fire, right?
Yeah, it's going to be literally a giant fucking forest fire.
yeah.
but it's like trends will continue until they stop and change, and this is what always happens. Like you don't have you just imagine rabbits in a forest. They're going to double until something prevents them from doubling, like wolves. and then they'll stop. Like, I would say the core fallacy with most of these crazy predictions is this trend extrapolation thing. And this is why any prediction from the IPCC that lasts, it's like 80 years in the future, I just ignore it, as do the meteorologists, I should say, because it is based on the assumption that trends are going to continue forever and human beings are going to do nothing to change their circumstance. And so this is very different than denying climate change, which again, we have to repeat over and over again. And it's also important to recognize that part of the way that trends change is through environmental activism. And so activism is important, and petitioning, say, for the removal of DDT, which came about from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, was a great thing for the environment. And so I'm also in favor of environmental activism, as long as people don't take all of the doom and gloom predictions to the extent where they're literally considering not having kids. Like, so like, do you see Scott Alexander's piece?
It was a great post.
Yeah. So like, different places in the blogosphere are starting to notice that there's just something weird with how much this climate change subject, it just seems to be terrifying the shit out of people, to the extent that they're not having kids. Like, what are you doing? Think like the world is great.
If anything, we need more kids at the moment. Honestly, we're running out of kids.
Because who are going to be the people solving these problems? It's the children. And so we want kids for the banal reason that we want more people to work on, say, environmental problems.
So just on your trends point, we should say that there's nothing wrong with extrapolating trends into the future. It's when these become predictions for what will happen, as opposed to observations about, for example, how resources are being used. Excellent. So it's completely fine to say, if the assumptions of this model are met, right? If we discover no more oil in the ground, and if we don't figure out a different energy source, we're going to run out of oil in the year 2055 or something. As long as we're not ensconcing that in some air of certainty and ignoring the fact that we probably will come up with other methods to extract energy from the environment, right? And so it's just when we start to take these trends as obvious truths that there emerge a problem. And in fact, just extrapolating trends and modeling and stuff can help us prioritize problems and realize when there is a problem and stuff. Excellent point. It all plays a role. It's just that when this gets like sucked into the public sphere and then amplified by, sort of scaremongers on social media, that it becomes a huge problem. And then people just kind of end up being taken advantage of, who don't know how to read these studies and stuff, right?
It's a really excellent point, because like, when trend extrapolation is used, it's used as one of many different predictive tools, none of which are taken as absolute truth, but just used as a means of starting to think about different choices that are available. But no prediction is taken as gospel truth, because it can't be taken as gospel truth. But that message is forgotten when the trend is moved from paper to an article to culture.
Yeah, beautiful. We got pushed on where our data was coming from the deaths from natural disasters decreasing over time. I think I made two claims in the previous episode. One was that the deaths from natural disasters has been decreasing significantly over time. All sorts of natural disasters, so fires, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc., extreme climate events. And this is taken from the MDOT Natural Disasters Database, which is a weird acronym, but it stands for the U.S. Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance and Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters International Disaster Database. And so you can actually just see it. You can see it on Our World in Data, which is like a nice place to see it. And then if you just fit like a 10-year, they just have it year by year. And then if you fit like, if you do the average over 10 years, it's very, very clear. It's just like decreasing enormously over time. And so some like stark differences are just from 2004 to 2013, worldwide climate deaths plummeted to 88.6% below that of the peak decade, which was 1930 to 1939. And then the year 2013 had 29,000 reported deaths. The year 1932 had over 5 million reported deaths for these climate-related deaths. And so this is a decrease of more than 99%. And it's also important to note that our ability to catch these kind of deaths has actually just gotten better over time, because we have like more surveillance, much more satellite imagery. a lot of these deaths would have just gone unreported in the past. Like if there's an earthquake in the middle of Bangladesh, like, are we going to know how many people died if this happens in 1950? Probably not. Now we're going to know like pretty exactly how much is going to happen. So if anything, the climate deaths occurring in the past were underreported. So this statistic is a conservative estimate on the number of climate related deaths and how much they've decreased over time. The other statistics was cold deaths versus heat deaths. And there are 10% more cold deaths annually than there are heat deaths, which is not something you'd expect if you're worried about like temperatures rising, right? So this is already counterintuitive.
10% or 10 times?
10 times.
So there are 10 times more people who die from the cold than die from the heat.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, good.
10 times. Yeah, exactly. So this original stat came from a study in The Lancet. There was a longitudinal 2000 to 2019 study. We'll put that in the show notes. But Slatestar Codex, or I guess Astral's Codex 10, just wrote a post about this called The Chilling Effect, which I just highly recommend. It's interesting. And he dives into a bit of the confusion around it because there doesn't seem to be super clear mechanisms as to why. And there's some oddities that surround it. So, for example, the excess heat deaths, where there's the most heat deaths compared to cold deaths, are happening in the coldest places. So the coldest places are seeing the most excess heat deaths, and similarly, the most excess cold deaths are happening in the warmest places. So
that makes sense in the sense that if you're in a warm place, you don't have the infrastructure to deal with the cold.
But especially in the warmest places, it just doesn't get that cold. Like, should anyone be dying at like 15 to 20 degrees Celsius?
I think that passes my intuition check in the sense that if you're in, I don't know, sub-Saharan Africa, you probably do not have any clothing or resources to deal with sub-zero temperatures at all, because how often are you going to encounter that, right? And so when you have, I don't know, one spike of cold, I imagine people are not capable of handling it. And I also think that the closer you get to like really hot places, things get poorer. Is that true? Like equatorial African countries and stuff. So there may be some confounding factors as well.
Okay, but then why would the excess heat deaths occur in the coldest places? So like Scandinavia and Greenland.
Yeah, that I don't understand. I understand the other one a bit more.
Infrastructure to deal with it, right? I mean, it's true as long as it actually, you're seeing spikes of cold, right? Like you'd have to make sure that the cold deaths, to pass your hypothesis, are happening during like peak periods of cold. And like if it drops below zero weirdly for a day. But in a lot of these places, that would be very rare.
Yeah. And we'd have to see like how they even count deaths by cold and deaths by heat. Yeah.
Anyway, but this is all to say that there's actually there's many more cold deaths than the heat deaths. And this kind of stat has actually led Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in economics a couple of years ago. He estimated the optimal temperature for the Earth would be actually another 4 degrees Celsius warmer. It would improve living conditions in the coldest places substantially while not overly affecting the warmest places. And so we are worried about temperatures getting very hot very quickly, and especially if there's like a positive feedback loop induced there. But just warming by itself is not necessarily a terrible thing. Just wanted to make that clear. But again, we have to be worried about like climate sensitivity and stuff, right? So the issue is that like as we're injecting more CO2 into the atmosphere, we're unsure of those effects, and so we could end up with some like atmospheric triggers or something that causes massive like floods and hurricanes and forest fires and things like this.
I just want to make one comment about deaths due to natural disaster decreasing significantly. And like it's not magic. It's that it's the same process that the listener may have of, I don't know, there's a flood in their neighborhood one year, and then the next year they think, oh, we should get a sump pump so that the next time the flood is back, we will be more prepared for it. But this is the process just scaled up everywhere. And so, of course, deaths are decreasing because people are coming up with ideas to make themselves a bit more resilient to bad things happening. And this is what I think about when I say the word technology, because I think that the word technology can kind of have this like, ooh, technology is going to save everything. No, it's just people figure out ways to improve their lives locally, and then they communicate their ideas to other people.
And bringing us back to growth, like growth is so important because it gives people and countries the means to actually implement these solutions.
Exactly.
Right? So why we want increasing wealth, increasing prosperity is because as disasters happen and as these bad things happen, we want people to actually be able to implement and pay for solutions. And this is increasingly what's been happening across the whole world as the world does get wealthier and wealthier. And then just to your techno point, one weird thing I find so fascinating about the
techno point. Nobody listens to techno.
Point about technology. So the environmentalist movement will often be like very harsh on any sort of techno optimism or like technology being able to solve problems or any sort of not claim, but just that like acknowledgement that humans do have this like very amazing ability to like solve their problems. Mm-hmm. But then they'll turn around and like advocate for using like solar panels for the whole world. And that is techno-utopianism, right? Where you're just assuming this one
Excellent
thing,
point.
this one brand of technologies can save everything, when it clearly cannot right now. So if we transition to renewables, you are just hoping on a wing and a dime that somehow we're going to be able to figure out how to store all this energy overnight and create enough as we need. And so when I see environmentalists like throwing the techno-utopian label at people, it just pisses me off so much.
There's a point that Václav Smil made about like windmills and solar panels, that with windmills in particular, like if he wanted to come up with the perfect embodiment of fossil fuels, he could not do a better job than windmills, because it's created out of this like solid steel pillar, and then it has these giant spinning blades that are all made of some high performing plastic. Right. And then you have copper radiating out of the base of the windmill to various charging stations. And what's the copper made out of, and how is it transported? So it's dug out of the ground using giant diesel tractors and construction equipment, and then it's refined in high energy furnaces and smelted down and then shipped all across the world. And then how do you actually get the windmills onto the land? Well, you have to drive all of your construction people, and it's fossil fuels all the way down. And solar panels, it's this very resource intensive mineral extraction with like rare earth minerals and stuff. And I'm not against windmills and solar panels. I think that they have a role to play like every other form of energy, but to think of them as being somehow opposite of fossil fuels rather than being made out of them and reliant upon them is just to, again, not really understand what it is you're advocating. All of this stuff is related, which is why you talk about energy portfolios and trade-offs. And it's like, what's the right amount of windmills and solar panels in conjunction with nuclear power, in conjunction with some fossil fuels. And we need to talk about trade-offs. We can't just talk about absolutes. And it plays nicely with your point that windmills and solar panels are technology. And if like it's technology that relies on energy, which is what we're talking about. But I also think, like with the environmentalist movement and stuff, I don't think all of these opinions are held by one person at the same time.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think when we describe it this way, we kind of point out contradictions, but we're not pointing out contradictions within the mind of like necessarily one person. Yeah. But I think for a lot of it, it's just in the zeitgeist where one person doesn't think through the implications of all of the various arguments. They're at a bar and someone's like, yeah, windmills are a good solution. They say, yeah, totally. They pass it on. And I just think it's important when we study like belief systems to point out that we're not really criticizing necessarily one person, because it's not a single person who says and thinks all of this at the same time. It's more just this giant bird's nest of 1,000 different views, which are all aggregated together as the environmentalist movement.
Yeah, it is fascinating how interrelated a lot of the like socialism, degrowth, anti-capitalism movements are, and like just how intertwined like, for example, the degrowth movement is with like anti-capitalist sentiment. I mean, I guess maybe it's just predicated on that, so that's not a surprise. Yeah, I've just kind of yet to figure out the ecosystem of beliefs here. Like, is it possible to be pro-capitalism and a degrowther? I'm not sure. Like,
it's a great question. And at some point we'll have to dive into it, because like even the word capitalism, like I don't even know what that really means. It means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people, and everyone just takes it for granted, as we all know what we're talking about. And we kind of do, but the word capitalism, I think, can just be thrown around to mean anything under the sun whenever you want it, whatever you want it to mean. So it has like a bit of a shape-shifting nature to it, I think. I don't know, any final thoughts? We should maybe wind this down. I think we should tell the listener that we're planning on doing some deep dives into some of these various subjects. I don't know. I think it would be fun to do an episode on different energy sources, like talk specifically about what oil is.
And a little bit further away from the actual like culture war side of climate change and more just focusing on just oil itself and the brute facts thereof. But entertaining, of course, because we're charming and entertaining. We can't help it. You know?
We got to bring our charm and our wit. Yeah. But so that's going to maybe be coming down the pipeline, I think. We're going to try to get some guests who know what they're talking about. Hopefully we continue this infinite cycle of criticism and response. But so
nice.
Come back at us, our friends, our listeners, and hopefully see some of you on the Discord.
Yeah.